When I graduated college a few years ago, I felt like I'd been handed a degree in failure. My part-time job barely covered groceries, let alone rent. Every month was a balancing act, and I was one unexpected expense away from total disaster. Eric, my older brother, stepped in at what felt like the perfect time. He and his wife, Laura, had a house with a spare room, and when he offered me a place to stay, I jumped at the chance. Eric and I had always been close. He was 7 years older, but never treated me like some annoying kid. Growing up, he was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, gave me my first beer when I turned 18, and bailed me out of trouble more times than I could count. So when he told me I could crash at his place while I got on my feet, I trusted him completely. Laura was harder to read. I didn't know her well. We'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings, but she seemed polite, if a little distant. She was pregnant at the time, so I figured she had enough on her plate without worrying about me. I promised myself I'd do everything I could to pull my weight. The first few months weren't bad. I cooked most of the meals, kept the house spotless, and ran errands whenever they needed. Eric reassured me that I wasn't a burden, even when I couldn't contribute financially right away. I made sure to chip in where I could, buying groceries when I had a little extra money or handling household tasks. Laura didn't say much to me, but she didn't seem upset either. If anything, she just seemed preoccupied. But after a while, I started noticing little things. Laura began making offhand comments about needing more space when the baby arrived. "I'm not sure where we'll put the crib," she'd say, glancing toward the guest room where I was staying. "Maybe we'll need to rearrange some things." At first, I brushed it off as idle conversation, but her tone started shifting. One evening, she laughed and said, "You'll probably find your own place before the baby comes, right?" It was said lightly, almost like a joke, but it stuck with me. Eric, as always, had my back. When I mentioned Laura's comments, he waved them off. "Don't worry about it," he said. "You can stay as long as you need. She's just stressed with the pregnancy." I wanted to believe him. He was my brother, and if he wasn't worried, why should I be? But Laura's behavior only grew colder. If I walked into the living room, she'd get up and leave. She stopped making small talk entirely, answering my questions with short, clipped responses or pretending she didn't hear me at all. I tried not to take it personally, convincing myself it was just hormones or stress. Then one night, everything shifted. I was cleaning up after dinner while Laura sat in the living room scrolling through her phone. Eric was working late, and the house was unusually quiet. Out of nowhere, Laura called my name. "Can we talk?" she said, her voice strangely calm. I set down the dish I was holding and walked over, thinking she might need help with something. She was still sitting, her phone resting on her lap, but her expression was unreadable. "I need to be honest," she started, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I've been feeling really uncomfortable with you staying here." Her words caught me off guard. Uncomfortable? Did I do something wrong? "It's not just about you," she said quickly. "It's the people you hang out with. I don't want that kind of influence around the baby." I stared at her, completely confused. "What people? I barely even go out, and when I do, it's usually just coworkers." "Eric mentioned that some of your friends are into questionable things," she said vaguely, her tone implying something darker. My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "None of my friends are involved in anything shady." Laura shrugged, as if she didn't believe me. "I'm just saying it's not a good environment for us. I think it's time you started looking for another place." I wanted to argue, to demand she tell me where this was coming from, but I was too stunned to speak. The way she said it, so matter-of-factly, like it had already been decided, left me reeling. I muttered something about needing to finish the dishes and walked back to the kitchen, my hands trembling. When Eric got home that night, I tried to bring it up, but he brushed it off the same way he always did. "Laura's just stressed," he said. "Don't let it get to you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening, something I didn't fully understand yet. The tension in the house only got worse after that conversation. Laura's polite indifference turned into outright avoidance. She wouldn't even look at me most days, let alone speak to me. I felt like a ghost walking through the house, unseen, unheard, and unwelcome. Eric kept pretending everything was fine, but I could tell he was starting to feel the strain too. Whenever I tried to talk to him about it, he'd just sigh and say, It'll blow over. Just give her some space. But it didn't blow over. It escalated. One night, Eric came home from work and barely acknowledged me before heading straight upstairs to Laura. I heard their voices muffled behind their bedroom door, Laura's tone sharp and agitated. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the weight of it hung over the entire house. When Eric came back down later, he avoided my eyes and muttered something about needing to figure things out. A few days later, I came home from work to find Laura sitting in the kitchen, waiting for me. Her expression was cold, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," she said flatly. "Okay," I replied, cautiously sitting down across from her. She took a deep breath, like she was preparing to deliver bad news she'd rehearsed in her head. "I've tried to be patient, but I can't keep pretending this is working. I don't feel safe with you here." Safe. The word hit me like a slap. "What are you talking about?" "You've been acting inappropriate," she said, her voice dripping with false calmness. "Inappropriate?" I repeated, stunned. Her gaze hardened. "You know what I mean. The way you've been around me. The comments, the looks. It's not okay, especially with the baby coming." I froze, my mind racing to process what she just said. Comments? Looks? Was she seriously accusing me of, what? Flirting with her? I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. "That's insane," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I've never, Laura, I would never." "Eric noticed it too," she interrupted, cutting me off. "He said he's been uncomfortable with the way you act around me. He just didn't want to bring it up because you're his brother." Her words knocked the air out of me. Eric noticed? No, there was no way. Eric wouldn't believe something like that. He knew me better than anyone. "That's not true," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Eric wouldn't say that. He knows me. He knows I'd never do something like that." Laura shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Believe what you want, but this isn't up for debate. You need to leave. We'll give you a couple of days to figure things out, but I want you out before the weekend." I stared at her, my hands clenched into fists under the table. "And what does Eric have to say about this?" "He agrees," she said simply. I didn't believe her. I couldn't. But the doubt had already started creeping in. That night, I waited for Eric to come home, determined to get answers. When he finally walked through the door, I cornered him in the living room. "Did you tell Laura that you think I've been inappropriate?" I demanded, skipping the pleasantries. Eric froze, his face pale. "What?" "She said you noticed something," I said, my voice rising. "That you think I've been flirting with her." He sighed heavily and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, man, it's not what you think." "So you did say something," I interrupted, my chest tightening. "Are you serious? You actually believe this crap?" "Laura's just been really stressed," he said, dodging my gaze. "She's hormonal, and she's got a lot on her mind. I don't want to make things harder on her." "So you're just going along with it?" I asked, incredulous. "You're letting her lie about me because it's easier than standing up to her?" "Don't make this a bigger deal than it needs to be," Eric said, his tone pleading. "I don't think you did anything wrong, okay? But she feels how she feels, and I have to put her and the baby first." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Eric was bending over backward to justify Laura's lies, all because he didn't want to rock the boat. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. "You're really going to let her push me out over something you know isn't true?" "It's not permanent," he said, as if that made it better. "We'll help you find a place, cover the deposit, whatever you need. But for now, it's just better this way." I stared at him, a mix of anger and heartbreak bubbling up inside me. "You're supposed to be my brother," I said quietly. "How can you let her do this to me?" He didn't have an answer. He just stood there, looking at the floor, while the silence between us grew heavier. That was the moment I realized I couldn't rely on Eric anymore. The brother I thought I could trust, the one who'd always had my back, was gone. In his place was someone who'd rather take the easy way out than stand up for what was right. I went to bed that night knowing my time in the house was running out. And the worst part? There was nothing I could do to stop it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of boxes being shuffled outside my room. At first, I thought I was imagining it, But when I opened the door, I found Laura stacking my belongings in the hallway. Clothes, books, random things I hadn't even unpacked yet. All of it was boxed up and piled like it had been dumped there in a hurry. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, stepping into the hall. Laura didn't even flinch. She looked up at me with a cool, detached expression and said, "I thought I'd help you get started. It'll make things easier when you leave." My stomach dropped. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking. "You don't even care how this affects anyone, do you?" "I care about my family," she shot back, crossing her arms. "That's my priority. I'm not going to apologize for protecting what's mine." Before I could respond, Eric came up the stairs, his face already tense. He took one look at the scene and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Laura, could you give us a minute?" She hesitated, but eventually shrugged and walked off, leaving me standing there with Eric. "This is what it's come to?" I asked, gesturing at the boxes. "You're just packing up my life like it doesn't matter?" "It's not like that," Eric said, his tone defensive. "Look, I didn't know she was going to do this today. I told her to give you more time, but she's stubborn." "Stubborn?" I laughed bitterly. "That's your excuse? She's throwing me out, Eric, and you're just letting her do it." "I told you I'd help," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We can cover your deposit, even pay for the first month's rent. I'm not throwing you out on the street." "You might as well be," I said, my voice rising. "You're kicking me out over nothing. Over lies. And now you're acting like you're doing me a favor? This is bullshit, Eric, and you know it." "I don't want to fight about this," he said quietly. "I'm trying to do what's best for everyone." "Everyone except me," I snapped. Eric didn't respond. He just stood there, looking defeated, and for the first time, I realized he wasn't going to change his mind. Whether it was out of loyalty to Laura or fear of confrontation, he'd already made his choice. I grabbed one of the boxes and carried it back into my room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and my head was spinning with anger and betrayal. How had it come to this? Just a few months ago, I'd felt safe here, like I had a chance to get back on my feet with my brother's support. Now I was being forced out, treated like a problem they couldn't wait to get rid of. The next few days were a blur of packing and frantic apartment hunting. I didn't have enough saved up for a decent place, so I started reaching out to friends, hoping someone would let me crash for a while. Jason, a friend from college, came through for me. He said I could stay with him temporarily, but I could tell from his tone that it wasn't a long-term solution. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was ready to leave, even if it was the last thing I wanted. I couldn't bear to stay in that house any longer, knowing how little I mattered to the people I thought were family. On my last day there, Eric helped me carry my boxes out to my car. Laura stayed inside, conveniently avoiding the awkwardness of saying goodbye. As we loaded the last of my things, Eric handed me an envelope. "This should cover your deposit and rent," he said, avoiding my gaze. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "You think money fixes this?" "I'm trying to help," he said weakly. "No, Eric," I said, shaking my head. "You're trying to make yourself feel better. But this doesn't fix anything." He didn't argue. He just nodded, like he didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I got into my car and drove away without looking back. I wanted to scream, to cry, to punch something, but instead, I just drove in silence, feeling a numbness settle over me. It wasn't until I pulled into Jason's driveway that it hit me. I was officially on my own. That night, lying on Jason's couch surrounded by boxes, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to Eric and Laura, to the way they treated me, to how easily they turned their backs on me. I wanted to hate them, but mostly, I just felt hurt. I'd always thought family was supposed to have your back no matter what. Now I wasn't so sure. Life at Jason's place wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying in Eric and Laura's house where I felt like an intruder in my own life. Jason was kind enough not to make me feel like a burden, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I kept my boxes stacked neatly in the corner of his living room and tried to make myself invisible, slipping out early for work and coming back late to minimize the time I was around. He never said anything, but I could feel the unspoken pressure of overstaying my welcome. Every spare moment was spent looking for apartments I could afford, but nothing within my budget was remotely livable. The rent prices were astronomical, and the meager savings I'd scraped together barely put a dent in what I'd need for a deposit. To make matters worse, I couldn't stop replaying what had happened with Eric. The anger and betrayal lingered like a wound that wouldn't close, and it clouded my thoughts even when I tried to focus on moving forward. For weeks, I pushed myself harder than ever. I picked up every extra shift I could, took on freelance work during my off hours, and cut my spending down to the bare minimum. No nights out, no takeout meals, no indulgences at all. It was exhausting, but I refused to let Eric's betrayal define me. I was going to get back on my feet, no matter how long it took. The silence from Eric was deafening. Not a single text or call to check on me, no acknowledgement of what he'd done. Part of me wanted to reach out first, to tell him exactly how badly he'd hurt me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would be the point? He'd made his choice, and I had to live with it. One night, as I scrolled through endless apartment listings that were all out of my price range, my phone buzzed. For a second, my heart leapt, thinking it might be Eric. But when I glanced at the screen, it was my mom. "How are you doing?" she asked after the usual pleasantries. Her voice was warm but cautious, like she was treading on thin ice. "I'm fine," I said, though my tone probably gave me away. "Have you talked to Eric?" she asked. The question made my chest tighten. "No. Why would I?" "He's been going through a lot," she said, ignoring the edge in my voice. "You know, with the baby and everything else. I'm sure he feels terrible about what happened." I laughed bitterly. "Does he? Because he hasn't reached out once. If he felt so bad, don't you think he'd have called me by now?" Mom sighed, the kind of sigh that always made me feel like I was being unreasonable, even when I wasn't. "You know how Eric is. He's not good at apologizing, but he loves you. Family sticks together, no matter what." I nearly dropped the phone. "Family sticks together?" I repeated, my voice rising. Where was that energy when I needed a place to stay? When Laura was making up lies about me, and Eric just stood there and let her throw me out? "That's not family, Mom. That's betrayal." She was quiet for a moment, and I could tell she didn't know how to respond. "I just don't want you to lose your relationship with him," she said finally. "Maybe I already have," I said flatly. "And that's not on me." The call ended soon after, leaving me more frustrated than before. It felt like no one in my family wanted to acknowledge what had happened. To them, I was supposed to just forgive and forget because that's what family does. But I couldn't. Not yet. A few weeks later, I finally caught a break. A tiny studio apartment became available in an older building on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were scuffed, the appliances were ancient, and the neighborhood was questionable, but it was affordable. I jumped on it immediately, signing the lease before someone else could swoop in. Moving and felt surreal. For the first time in months, I had a space that was completely mine. No walking on eggshells, no worrying about being kicked out. It was small and bare, with only a mattress on the floor and a few second-hand pieces of furniture I'd picked up, but it was home. That first night, I lay on my mattress staring at the ceiling, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. I'd done it. I'd pulled myself out of the mess Eric and Laura had left me in, and I didn't owe them, or anyone else, a damn thing. But as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, I couldn't stop thinking about Eric. I missed the brother I'd grown up with, the one who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me through my first heartbreak. The Eric I knew would have never let something like this happen. Had I been wrong about him all along? Or had Laura changed him? The questions kept me up at night, but no matter how many times I turned them over in my mind, I couldn't find an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not yet, maybe not ever. For now, I had to focus on myself and the life I was building, one step at a time. For a while, I thought I'd finally left it all behind. My new apartment was quiet, and I threw myself into work, determined to keep moving forward. I wasn't thriving exactly, but I was stable, and after months of chaos, that felt like a victory. I kept my routine simple: work, save, sleep, repeat. On weekends, I'd take long walks around the neighborhood or tackle DIY projects in my tiny apartment, trying to make the place feel like home. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the present, Eric lingered in the back of my mind. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering if he regretted what had happened, if he missed me the way I missed him. Other times, I felt a wave of anger so intense it made my chest ache. How could he let things get so bad? How could he stand there and let Laura destroy everything between us? I didn't reach out, though. Pride wouldn't let me, and I convinced myself that it was for the best. If Eric cared, he'd call. But he didn't. That silence was broken one evening when my phone rang unexpectedly. I was in the middle of cooking dinner, and when I saw Eric's name on the screen, I froze. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity, and maybe a little hope, got the better of me. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. "Hello?" "Hey," Eric said, his voice cautious, almost hesitant. I stayed quiet, waiting for him to explain why he was calling after all this time. "Look," he began, "I know it's been a while, and I'm sorry for that. I should have reached out sooner, but things have been rough." I didn't say anything. He sighed, and I could hear the tension in his voice. "The business went under," he continued. "We lost the house. Laura and we're being evicted. We've got nowhere to go." I gripped the phone tighter, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "And now you're calling me," I said, my voice sharp. "After months of silence, you're calling because you need something." "It's not like that," Eric said quickly. "I mean, it is, but I'm not, damn it. I don't know how to say this. We've got 2 kids now, and we don't have anyone else to turn to. I know I don't deserve to ask for your help, but I'm desperate." His words hung in the air, heavy with desperation and guilt. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, replaying every moment of betrayal, every lie Laura had told, and every time Eric had stood by and let her push me out. And now he wanted me to save them? "You're serious?" I asked, my tone laced with disbelief. "I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't this bad," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, just for a little while. We'll figure something out, I promise." I felt a lump forming in my throat, but it wasn't sympathy. It was anger. "Do you have any idea what you're asking me?" I said, my voice trembling. "You threw me out, Eric. You let Laura lie about me. You let her destroy our relationship, and now you want me to open my door to you? Do you even hear yourself?" "I know," he said quietly. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. But this isn't about me or Laura. It's about the kids. They don't deserve to go through this." The mention of his kids hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't even met them. Part of me wanted to hang up right then and there, to tell him to deal with the mess he'd made, but another part of me, the part that still cared, hesitated. "Give me some time to think about it," I said finally, my voice flat. "Thank you," Eric said, relief seeping into his tone. "Take as much time as you need. I'm sorry for everything, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." After I hung up, I just stood there in my kitchen, staring at the stove as the pot of water for my pasta boiled over. My mind was a storm of emotions, anger, hurt, guilt, and a sliver of something I couldn't quite name. Part of me wanted to slam the door in Eric's face, to let him feel the same rejection I'd felt. But then I thought about those kids, about how none of this was their fault. The next few days were filled with internal debates. Every time I thought I'd made up my mind, I'd second-guess myself. If I let them stay, would it just open the door to more pain? Could I trust Eric not to let Laura tear me down again? But if I said no, could I live with the guilt of knowing I'd turned away 2 kids who didn't deserve any of this? My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Eric, updates on how little time they had left before they were out on the street. My parents called too, piling on the guilt. "They need you," my mom said during one particularly tense conversation. "Your family. You can't just turn your back on them." "Family?" I snapped. Where was that when I needed them? They didn't care then. Why should I care now? "It's different," she insisted. "There are children involved now. Think about them." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. By the time the weekend rolled around, I still hadn't made a decision. The weight of it pressed on me constantly, and no matter which way I leaned, it didn't feel right. Either way, I knew I'd be losing something, my peace or my pride. I just didn't know which one I was willing to sacrifice. In the end, I called Eric. My stomach churned as I listened to the phone ring, each second feeling like an eternity. When he answered, his voice was tight, hopeful. "So," he asked cautiously. "I can't let you stay here," I said, cutting straight to the point. The silence on the other end was deafening, but I pushed through. "I've thought about it, Eric, over and over. I just can't. I've worked too hard to rebuild my life, and I can't risk letting you and Laura bring all that chaos back into it. I'm sorry, but the answer is no." There was a long pause, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "I see. I'll help you in other ways," I offered, though my words felt hollow. "I've already sent you some resources, shelters, programs. I'll even cover the cost of a motel for a couple of weeks if you need it, but I can't let you move in." "I get it," he said, though his tone made it clear he didn't. "Thanks for whatever." The call ended with no dramatic blow-up, just an empty silence that lingered long after I hung up. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone, waiting for the guilt to hit me harder than it already had. But it didn't. For the first time, I felt like I'd stood my ground, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Eric and I hadn't spoken since, and I wasn't sure if we ever would again. Part of me mourned the relationship we'd had, but another part of me knew it was gone long before that phone call. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is protect your peace, even from the people you thought would never harm it. But that's exactly what I did. And for once, I didn't regret it.